So today's presenter, first off, we have Elizabeth Buck from Cornell. So Elizabeth Buck is a fresh market vegetable specialist in the Cornell Vegetable Program. She started working with high tunnel growers in 2009 and has participated in several tunnel-related research projects. Elizabeth regularly provides technical assistance regarding high tunnel site selection, site preparation, and post-construction site modifications. She sent along a couple of fact sheets, which you can find in the back here in Kentville. If anybody in the remote locations wants those fact sheets, please just send me an email and I can make sure that you have those. But yeah, Elizabeth, do you want to take it away?
I can do that. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm just going to get the slideshow up here. And should all be seeing my screen right now. Looking good, Judd? Yeah. All right. So, good morning, everyone. Like I said, I'm Elizabeth Buck, Fresh Market Specialist, and we're just going to go through some of the factors in selecting sites and a little bit of site preparation. I always like to stop and frame up what you're trying to do, what the intentions are. So in looking at why you're putting up a tunnel and looking at the sites, I think there's 4 questions that should always be in the back of the mind. Even as we go through the main part of the presentations, these 4 are really going to underpin the whole operation. So it's, what am I planning to grow? It may sound silly at this point in time, but as we get through the talk, you'll see that the crops you want to do are really going to change some of your siting decisions. Your land characteristics, that one's going to fit in, right? That one makes sense. Weather characteristics, that's going to be a big influence on where you can site your tunnel. And then how much investment and labor do I have to get this thing set up? Some people can, they have a lot of help and they can get things set up very quickly. They can do it to a greater capacity. Some folks are looking to start a little smaller and build with time. 6. There are only six things that really are going to make or break your tunnel over the long term. And each one of those 6 things are siting factors. If those 6 siting factors are managed well from the get-go, they're going to significantly lower your chances of there being any problems. The lowest chance of having big problems in tunnel, follow these 6 siting factors: light, orientation of the tunnel, wind, ease, that's going to be more of like a convenience type thing, soil, and topography. Conveniently, that works and spells out lowest. Try and make it mnemonic. So we'll go through them quick. Light is the very easiest one. This photo here is exactly what you want to see. There's good strong laying on all of the tunnels. You can see that they're well spaced. There's at least as wide as 1 tunnel in between each of those houses. They're not shading each other. The tree line across the road is far enough that it's not casting any shadows on these tunnels. And so this is an example of what you're going for with light. Light is pretty easy in that regard. But when you move into winter growing, things change a little bit, right? So winter growing is an entirely different setup, and that's where you really need to pay a bit more attention to what your lighting scheme is going to be like. And I understand that your climate there is pretty mild. So winter growing is probably something that's very feasible for you. It's feasible throughout all of New York, and we have some very cold areas here. So when you are growing in the winter versus the summer, you need to really think about orienting your house differently. So here we've got 2 lovely high tunnels, north marked on each of these. I'm just going to take you through how the light changes with the seasons and how that affects how you might decide to turn your tunnel. So in the summertime, sun passes right over top of a tunnel, north-south, or if the house is oriented east-west. In either case, you're not really losing much light at all, right? It's going to come right over top and it's going to be very nice. But what happens in the winter when that sun is lower is that it's going to bounce around the bottom end of that house, especially if it's oriented north-south, and you're going to get a shading effect, okay? When you have a house oriented east-west, the sun comes along the side and you get much smaller areas of shading just off the end of the end walls and parallel to the end walls. That's because the sun is coming through and shining through the sidewall. So that way you get a lot more light distribution. So if anyone is considering growing winter greens, especially seeing as how you're a lot further north than we are, it's probably a good idea to think about turning your house. But when you turn it for the light, what's that do with the wind, right? There's two pieces to balance in orienting your tunnels. And it's a question of what your exact site is like. And again, going back to what do you plan to grow? If you are, I was told that the prevailing winds in the area are generally out of the west or northwest. So here they come. They are going to be striking a north-south tunnel mostly on the long side of it. That's really good. We want lots of ventilation through these houses. It's really common to see problems, foliar disease problems, when there isn't enough ventilation. But then you have to balance it with, am I in a really windy site? Is this going to become a flight risk? On the flip side, if you have it laying east-west and it's getting hit on the end wall, can push the house a little bit because they are basically just a set of poles, right? That's not the most stable structure in the world. So it does push on the end wall, especially solid end walls. So it's can push, but then you also have the option to design as sturdy of an end wall as you can and want. The real downside is that it can lessen the amount of ventilation depending on what the other characteristics of your site are like. So what we see in practice is that most growers are going to choose to orient the house so that they're getting the most cross breeze possible and they're managing for the ventilation. That then means that they have to work a little bit more on making sure that the house is easy to take care of. So we've gone through L, O, and W, light, orientation, and wind. We're working through lowest, remember? Before we get to the E's, I tend to get the questions, okay, I mentioned flight risk, right? Well, that sounds scary. There are some structural things that you can do to reduce flight risk, and things like having deep ground posts with very solid, strong bolts, having additional ground anchors. There are a variety of different, basically anti-flapping techniques that people do, and insulated double poly. This isn't a structures talk, but that's the common answer. It doesn't matter what your structural build is like. If you are getting a hurricane, there's a very real chance this thing is going to take off on you. This is a high tunnel that took off in a 40-mile-an-hour wind in this town that my office is located in. And you can see all the damage that happened. And this house didn't even get flipped over or anything. It got picked up and tossed right back down on the ground. So you can see all the bent pipes here, broken piping there. The boards are all out of place. What happened? They put the tunnel in the wrong spot. The wind was funneling between a house and a barn, and it looked like a protected spot, but it was actually open to the prevailing wind. So it was just a bad site. It would have taken off eventually, no matter how well they had it anchored down. Tree lines, yes. If you really want to make sure that your site is protected and you're going to put up, you're frequently seeing gusty winds, you have, you want a long-term investment here. If you're at risk of getting a strong windstorm or a small hurricane every 5 years or so, that's fairly frequent. Siting your tunnel so that you're protecting it behind a windbreak, like that very first photo I showed you with the little houses and the fall foliage in the background, that's going to be the best way to protect your house. You just have to make sure that, again, for the light, you're out far enough from the trees to not get shade. So this is going to be your best way to go. Some nice trees. Okay, ease. Ease comes down to really convenience. Problems happen in tunnels when they're out of sight and out of mind. It's easy to say, okay, I'm going to put it, I have the best land, the best spot, I'm going to put it up back on the hill, but I can't see it there. What happens sometimes is that, well, you're not quite as much on top of it. That's why driving around to farms, the tunnels tend to be very close to a building for not only access to utilities and such, but because they're constantly there as a reminder. So tunnels need a lot of babysitting, and you want it to be convenient for you to run out and put the sides up and down as the temperatures change, as the wind conditions change. You want to make it easy for yourself to go out and check on what the snow load is, or how much is it flapping around in the wind, Did I leave the irrigation on? The other ease part with your siting is really all about making your work efficient and making sure that your crop inside the tunnel is going to have access to everything it needs. So that's going to be high quality water. Lots of times some folks like to run electricity. You certainly don't need it out in a tunnel to be successful. Like some folks choose to heat, a lot of folks do not. But if everyone really does benefit when they set the tunnel up in an area that's easy to access with the equipment. But again, you have to make sure it's not in the way. If you plan to expand farm lanes or expand equipment size, give yourself a little space there. You never want to get caught in that situation where you've run out of space. We're on to S. So soils. Soils, you really want to start with a well-drained, resilient soil, the best structure you can find. If you have high organic matter, all the better. Something that's not compacted, not addicted to tillage. And to top it all off, let's throw in there a low seed bank. As I wrote this up, I decided I like my tunnel ground like I like my numbers. It's got to be prime. It's got to be prime. And here's why. Over time, tunnels tend to stay in the same spot, right? There's not a lot of folks who have movables, and they're really not well suited for very windy conditions either. So the soils, they get beat up, they get a different sort of regime than the field production. It's hard to rotate. They get prone to all of these issues here. And I'm not going to dive into that because Judson's going to, I think, go through a couple of these things later. But you want to start in the very best condition you can and then maintain it. If you're already working on a depleted soil in a challenging soil management environment, your crop's not going to do as well. So that brings me to the final one of the 6 big factors. That's topography. And topography is going to be your top concern. It's as simple as this. Why invest in water exclusion structure if you can't control the ground moisture? Just gonna let you guys reflect on that for a moment. So the ideal topography is going to be the top of a drainage profile. It's not only enough to be on top of the drainage profile. What happens is that the soil is being worked inside the house quite frequently, and with the way the water moves off of the structure, that there tends to be a settling effect. And so when you first start out, it helps to raise the inside of the tunnel at least 5 centimeters over the exterior surrounding land, planning and anticipating that. So not only are you on top of the drainage profile, you're also raising it up inside the house. In an absolute ideal world, you're aiming for something that's level across the width of the house. So that way it's not encouraging water to cut across, and a slight pitch down the length. Again, that way any water coming off the top is going to move away. Now, there's really a lot of grading to be done with something like that. And so grading is an expensive process. It's one that can beat the soil up. And if it's just, I have a little bump, I need to smooth it out. Okay, fine. Bring in some topsoil, move some things around, bring in some compost. Lots of folks do that. Some people do decide to go through and grade a site, and oftentimes it's good practice to sort of strip the topsoil off first, so you're not compacting it as much and you're just going over and filling it over the top once the main part of the site has been leveled out. And again, grading is one of those things where we get back to that original question of what's my investment, what's my labor situation looking like to get started. But here's why topography is the most important thing of all. Each of these scenarios all occurred in the same spring. None of these produced decent crops. Every single one of them had to do with a combination of the water rolling off the side and the water rolling in from the field. If you have a 3,000 square foot tunnel, right? Like a 900 guys, I can't do the metrics, I'm sorry. 90 square meter maybe? Anyway, you have a house, regular size house, and it's really easy to be like, oh, the water will just come off, the water will just come off. But what ends up happening is down the 96 or 100-foot length of that house, you're getting a drop zone of about 2 inches where half of the water from that entire structure is dropping. It comes off in sheets when it comes off of these structures. So it's really an erosive force. If there's not something there to absorb that and send the water somewhere, it's going to start eroding like it did underneath these boards. And that comes in. And this is a case where this house was originally built level to the surrounding area. It settled. It then was lower, and then it also was sloped headed across. So they ended up having to put drainage cuts in an attempt to save their crop, and that didn't even come close to working. Similar situation here where the water was running off the side and also running off of, they had a construction project here, changed the flow and started swamping out the back of the house. And so these little plants never grew up and never did much on the end. So water is the #1 siting issue when it comes to high tunnels. And it'll catch up with you in so many ways. It's going to increase your compaction risk. There's a ton of foot traffic going through there. And so the ground does pack in. Naturally, it's going to go and increase your soil-borne disease, your damping off and pythium. This was a case of verticillium in a tunnel that had not standing, but had a soggy water problem. As you're getting more root rots, you're going to see manifested nutrient deficiencies. They're actually a function not of the fertility, but of the conditions. One of the most aggravating things with growing a high value crop like those cherry tomatoes that you saw in the very beginning is that they crack when they're given a sudden burst of water. So if you've gone all the way to maturity and you have a good looking crop and then the water floods in and cracks it, you've lost that, all because there's nowhere for the water to go. And then the lack of uniform that comes with uneven plants and decreased efficiencies, right? So you spend a lot of time in tunnels. They're high intensity environments, so you want to make the most of that time and that investment. Prevention, couple simple things. If there's any one thing you take away from this talk, it's that you need to manage the water and you need to manage it right underneath the drop zone, and a French drain or a regular ag tile line is underneath is a good way to do that. You have to make sure though that it's got a little collection point to go to. So adequate spacing, that just means that your tunnels are spaced far enough apart. At least the width of the house, 1.5 times is better. And that's to give the water somewhere to go and to make sure they aren't shading each other. And I'll show you a third reason in a couple minutes here. Good grading, whenever it's possible, as much as feasible. Again, some sort of gravel, a French drain is fancy, right? But even gravel along the edge with some sort of diversion to the end of the house just to send it down the sides can be really helpful. I think so much can be done with changing the surface water flow around it with a diversion. And lots of times that's solve folks' problems, is figuring out where most of the water is running off from. In one case I worked with, it was running off of the roof of a barn, across the parking lot, and then across the field and hitting the tunnel. And it was something they weren't aware of. And all they did was put in a swale and it cleaned it right up, and then raised beds just to pick them up as you would out in the field. So here's the final reason for making sure that your houses are well spaced. It snows. I live in Buffalo. We get a lot more snow out here than most areas. But these photos, none of these were taken in Buffalo. These were all taken in, middle of upstate New York. As the snow sheds off the structure, it's got to go somewhere and accumulate and pile, right? So that's going to start pushing back against the structure, and you need to push it off. If the houses are spaced too tightly, that entire area in the center is going to fill up with snow, and that's just not a good situation. What happens sometimes is snow will push back in against the sides, stretch the plastic. Sometimes it will break through the plastic. This is kind of a worst case scenario. This was a house standing by itself, and it was relatively well sheltered for the typical summer breezes, which came and hit it at the end wall, kind of on this corner. But their winter storms tend to come from a different direction. And what happened here was that all of the snow on the backside of the house drifted up against the high tunnel, and it pushed the side in. So underneath this red line should be a straight line of hoops. And because they forgot to check both summer and winter conditions, that poor sighting led to the loss of that house, and they never rebuilt that. That was done, and that house was lost with a winter greens crop in it. So I know I can't see you all. I wish I could, but I did build in a couple of practices to do, and so I'd like to do this one together and just talk through. Okay, here's a site. What are the important factors in assessing it? And I'm going to show you guys a photo and just give you some food for thought so you can go through and, practice on your own, start thinking through things. So we're going to start in a summer crop. These are, trellis tomatoes. The setup here is a multi-bay high tunnel structure, something like a hay grove is one type that's common here. And so these tunnels are held down with, the plastic's just slung over top. It accumulates in the bottom. There's nothing really fastening it down on the end here. It's all held down by these tie ropes. Okay. They've gone through and they've managed some weeds in the middle here. And I think this was over an acre site of tomatoes. So it's not a site where they're going to go through and do a lot of groundwork. And there is a little bit of a rise headed off that direction where another field drains in towards it. So I'm going to give you all a second or two to think about the elements of this site and how you would plan it accordingly or make adjustments to this site. What are the key factors that you're really looking for to make sure that this setup's going to work? I'm going to see if I can find the video to see you guys. Okay, I don't know if all the sites are set up on with the microphone, but I know the main site is. Does anyone have anything they've noted, anything particularly important to pay attention to here?
So Kenville, we're unmuted if you want to shout out an insight. Go ahead, Robbie.
Incorporate raised beds. Yeah. So one to do raised beds. Always a good idea to do raised beds. Okay. I also can't see where these things are coming from. So whoever you were, whatever site you were, okay, good. Of all of nature's elements, what is most likely to take this thing out? Wind. Yes. Yes, they have a lot of ropes and they are all tied down very tightly, and these things tend to be pretty well protected sites as much as possible. The other challenge with the hay groves is that they tend to be, because they're so large and you've got multiple bays, it actually can change the orientation sometimes, because with all of these tall crops going through, if you set the wind up to come in the length or come in from the side of the house, it's really not going to get very far and your ventilation isn't going to be great. So in the case of a multi-bay house like this, they may actually rotate it in this case, because there are no end walls, you get much better growing conditions and better humidity control if you have the wind coming down instead of across. The other thing that tends to be problematic here is water pooling up in the edge of the plastic. And in this case, they've got the plastic pulled up nice so it doesn't pool, but then they end up with mud pits in between the houses. And it looks like in this one, they've actually purposefully left some space there to let it be a mud pit instead of trying to push the production close to it. And that, again, is coming because they're doing a high trellis crop. If they're doing something lower, lots of times you'll see a row of something planted right there and it doesn't end up doing too well because it's constantly getting wet. All right, any other thoughts on this one? Okay, then the very last thing I have for you is this site, better pruning. Yeah, that's not a sighting thing. So this site, I put the date on there for you, the date and time, okay? And I'm looking for you guys to tell me what's the orientation of these houses, what crops are they likely growing, and give some solutions for, and identify what problems they're facing right now with the snow and what problems they'd be facing in the spring because of how tightly those two houses ended up being constructed. All right, Kentville says east-west. Yep. Yep, spinach, lettuce, some various mustards. Okay, Perennia is saying that the snow can push the size in. It absolutely can. So those photos I showed you earlier were of this house, and they had gone through on the inside and pushed from the inside, pushed the snow back as much as they could, but clearly it's not enough to make a difference. To give everyone a sense of scale, you see these footprints here? The area is, you know, you can put a snowblower through there, but where are you going to put the snow? And depending on what else they have on the ground or what's underneath, blow it over top. Yeah, a tractor to push it through. If they have a small tractor and they don't have any sort of ditches in the center, then they could go in there with a tractor and dig some of that out. If they had the room to space that out, if they had a bigger site, they would have, you know, it'd be a lot less labor for them in the winter. They would simply have to just pull it back from the edge and deposit it in the center of the two tunnels instead. And then there would be like a, you know, an A-frame or something less threatening. What's going to happen in the spring that's going to be problematic? Adam says no. Yep. Yep. Which more likely than not is going to come in. You're going to end up with wet sides on the tunnel. It's going to delay you from starting those beds. Yeah, delayed spring or an uneven spring in the house. So you're stuck either delaying the whole house, delaying a bed, or planting something when it's really not great conditions for it and sort of getting it off to a bad start to begin with. So that's all I've got. Thank you guys for going through the exercises. If there's any questions, I'm gonna give the controls back.
No. So no questions have come in yet from the other locations. Will anybody have any questions for Elizabeth? Other locations, do you have any questions that you're typing in maybe and Jen can relay?
What about reinforcing the sides so snow doesn't cave in?
Can you hear that, Elizabeth?
Yep, that happens a lot. it's not really something, it's not really ever done in a good situation. It's the preference to get the snow off the house first rather than to be in a situation where you're trying to prop it up with 2x4s on the rails. But if you have to, you do it.
Are there optimal sizes for a tunnel where there's heavy snow every few years?
I caught parts of that, but not the whole thing.
Is there an optimal size for tunnels where you have heavy snow maybe every other year?
Okay,
Like,
so
are you talking length,
Just keep the diameter and
diameter, and maybe height?
okay, so it's less about, in this case, the load bearing capacity of the structure is less about its size and more about its construction materials. So it's going to be heavier weight construction materials, so a thicker diameter pipe, and not the hollow part, but the actual gauge. How thick is that metal in that pipe? The biggest one is how tightly spaced are the bows. So going from a 5-foot spacing to a 3-foot spacing is going to really increase your snow bearing capacity, as will adding support structures in the roof. Generally speaking, a Gothic peak house is going to shed snow better and be a better choice in an area like Buffalo than a rounded Quonset hut. So that's less of a siting thing and more of a structural thing, so long as you're choosing a site that's not going to be overrun with snowdrifts or something.
And another question came in there on chat, Elizabeth. Are you using LEDs in winter production there?
I'm going to toss that one to Judd because he sees a lot of these, but I haven't seen LEDs used in high tunnels. That's more of a greenhouse thing, a soilless structure where they're adding a lot more heat and other investments into the crop.
Do you want me to answer that?
Have you seen it?
Quick answer is no for the type of systems that Elizabeth just shared with us, for several factors. And one being, if we're going to provide light, what has to go along with that light would be temperature. And these are kind of lower input situations. And even if we're forcing the canopy air temperature up, we'd still have to address the root zone temperature, which is going to be very low in a soil-based system. I think the final presenter today is going to talk about substrate production, and there you could begin to think about LEDs.
Thanks, Justin. Excellent. Is there any more from the chat, the other locations, or from Kentville? Questions?
Great, thanks a lot, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. Round of applause from Kentville, at least.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Are you going to stick around, or you've heard Judson talk before, so you're out?
I'll stick around for a while.
Okay. Yeah, so if there are further questions, you can email them to Jen and I, and we can convey them to Elizabeth. So if you think of a question later on tonight when you're telling your partner all about the amazing workshop you were just at, yeah, just email Jen.